Hi you guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we will be talking about Shark Tale. Now Shark Tale starts off with the logo from DreamWorks, except for the little guy on the moon is going fishing. So he dumps his fishing rod into the water, and there we see a worm hanging on a hook. And he is looking around, holding his breath, and scared because he knows that there are sharks coming. And then we get introduced to Lenny, a shark, but guess what? He doesn't eat worms or fish because he's a vegetarian, and Lenny is one of my favorite characters along with a few others. So he tries to get the fish free, and he says, "Oh, I will get you out of here in a jiffy. Just keep holding your breath, little wormy." And then Lenny's brother, Frankie, tells him, "Lenny, we gotta go. Pops is waiting." And then Lenny says, "Hang on, I'm coming, Frankie." And then Lenny sets the worm free, and the worm climbs back up the hook. And Lenny says, "You're free, little buddy. Go, go. Climb freedom." And then he bumps into his brother, and then his brother Frankie asks, "Lenny, what are you doing?" And then Lenny says, "Oh, I was just picking you some flowers." And then he picks him some flowers, and then Frankie just hits him out of his hand, and Lenny says, "Hey, Mom said it's not okay to hit." And then Frankie says, "Mom's not here." And then they swim off to go meet his dad. Their dad. And then Frankie starts to sing as they're swimming away the shark theme song. And then we meet Katie Current, the news reporter. Or should I say fish reporter? Yeah, I'm gonna say news reporter. So anyway, these are a world full of fish, if you guys can imagine. And Kate Curran says, "Are they gone?" And then I guess she gets information that they're gone. And then she says, "They are gone. Hello, Fish City." And then she does the report. And then she goes to the weather girl. And then the weather girl says the weather for today and what's going on in traffic. And then she says, "Is there anyone out there who can free us from the sharks?" And then we meet our main character, Oscar, who is showing us his new house on top of the reef until some little kids say, You have to be a real somebody and have a real something to. Okay. 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 So we are introduced to Oscar after the news reporter says, "Is there anyone who can protect us against the sharks?" And then we meet Oscar, who is showing us his new house on top of the reef with a TV, a PlayStation, and a spectacular view. And he looks so cool with his necklaces and sunglasses, swimming around. So, showing us his showing us his new house, and then Oscar says when the tour is over, he says, "You have to have a real something to get a house like this." And then and then one of the little fish, and then and and then the kid the kid's fish says, "Yeah, like you need money to have a place like this." And then Oscar says, "Why you guys have to knock me out of my fantasy?" Like, they took us out of the dream sequence because he's imagining this in his head. And when the kid said, "Yeah, you need money," that took us out of his fantasy. And then Oscar says, "Shouldn't you kids be at school?" And then and and then the kid saying, "Shouldn't you be at work?" And then Oscar says, "You got me." So he gives the kids the sunglasses and the necklaces and says, "You guys stay out of trouble, all right?" And they scare Oscar by painting the billboard with him in a shark's mouth. And then Oscar says, "Ah, clean that stuff up." And then Oscar is off to work, but first he stops at Krispy Kreme to get a donut. And then when he gets there, he already can see that his work card is already punched in. And then he knows exactly who did it. His best friend, Angie, who works at the front desk. And then Oscar goes to see her to say thank you for covering for him. And Oscar says, "What would I do without you?" And then he puts Angie's customer on hold while he dances with her. And before this, she was drawing on a piece of paper Angie and Oscar, because Angie has the crush on Oscar. And it's just so cute. She is one of my favorite characters too. And then Oscar tells Andy his new idea to get rich, bottled water, and then Andy tells Oscar that instead of instead of instead of getting in the boss's face with another wait, hang on, hang on. So Oscar tells Andy while he's talking to her that he's got another plan to get rich and to get out of the whale wash, because that's where they work at the uh, the whale wash. You get it? It's like a car wash, but they wash you get it. It's like a car wash, but they wash whales. You get it. You get it. So Angie tells Oscar instead of okay, okay. So Oscar tells Andy his new plan to get rich is to sell bottled waters. That all he needs is another investment on his paycheck from the boss, and he is out of here. And then Angie tells him instead of getting in the boss's face, instead of getting in Mr. Sykes' face with another of your get rich quick schemes, why don't you just go and do something you're actually good at? Your job, which a miracle you still have. And then Oscar comes back and says, "Oh, I almost forgot. I brought you some breakfast." And then he gives Andy the donuts. And then he tells Andy that, by the way, you're still on hold. And then Andrew and then Angie grabs the phone and says, "Hello, thank you for holding." But before this happens, Oscar was dancing with her. If you guys can remember that I told you that. Oscar was dancing with her. And then Oscar said, okay, Oscar Oscar was Oscar was dancing with her. And 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 and, and then and, and then when Oscar put the customer on hold, Andy said, "You're gonna get me fired." And then Oscar said, "You fired? That can't happen, because if I get you fired, I would have no reason to come to work." And then Andy just falls out for some reason. She she actually swims back into the chair and pretends that she just fainted for some reason. And I have no idea what this means, but I'm pretty sure it means that she likes Oscar more than a friend. But she hasn't told him yet. She actually hasn't told him yet. Okay, so Oscar is a tongue scrubber, and they are working on the whale's tongue. When Oscar is talking to himself about how rich he wants to be, another worker says, "Oh, wake up, Oscar, it could be worse." And then Oscar says, "Yeah, I can have this job and look like you." And then the whale had the hiccup. And then when Oscar see that the whale is gonna move, he says, "She's gonna blow." And then everybody gets out. And then Headphone Guy is still in there because somebody says Headphone Guy is still in there. And then actually Oscar pushes Headphone Guy out of the way, and it turned out that it was just a burp, and Oscar got his goggles dirty. But meanwhile, with Mr. Sykes, Oscar's boss, he is talking to his boss, Leon. So, Leon says, "From now on, you work for my sons, Frankie and Lenny." And then Mr. Sykes starts to laugh and says, "Lenny? Frankie, I can understand, but Lenny?" And then, and, and, and then Leon says, "What are you saying about my son Lenny?" And then, and, 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 and then Mr. Sykes says, "Well, Lenny isn't really a killer of fish." And then Leon says, "My Lenny has the brains. Now, my son Frankie may have the muscle, but my son Lenny has the brains, and he is a killer, a cold-blooded killer when it comes to fish." And then the sons finally show up to the office. And then Frankie says, "So, hey Pop, sorry we're late. Lenny had an accident. He was born." And then and then Lenny laughs and says, "Ha ha 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 ha. You are a comedy genius." And then Mr. Sykes says, "See? See what I mean? Your son is your son isn't a killer of fish." And then, wait, I've been saying it wrong. No, I'm saying it right. Leon the Shark says, "I bring you into my home. I tell you what's what. And now you want to disrespect my sons? Well, from now on, you owe me double of what you are giving me to protect that little whale wash of yours." So it turned out that Leon is paying for the whale wash, and that Mr. Sykes Now old Leon doubled the money. So he calls Oscar in and he says, "You are in big trouble, Oscar. You are into me for 5Gs. And then Oscar says, "Man, you're tripping, 5Gs." And then and then and then and then Miss and then and then Mr. Sykes tells and and then Mr. Sykes tells Oscar that I have the paperwork right here. And then he pulls out the paperwork, and then Oscar says, "Wow, you wrote everything down. That is why you are in management. That is why you are the manager, and I am not. You go, boy. You go." And then Mr. Sykes shows him the food chain. He says, "There are sharks. They are krill. There is me." And Oscar says, and then he says, "No, they are whales. There are regular fish. There's whale poo, and then there's you." And then Oscar says, "Wow, that's messed up." And Mr. Sykes says, "Because I like you, here's what I'm gonna do. You have until tomorrow morning to have all my money and to give it to me at the racetrack." And then Oscar says, "What happens if I don't?" And then Mr. Sykes says, "Well, the boys will explain. The two jellyfish that Mr. Sykes has working for him are two brothers called Bernie and Ernie. So they actually sting Oscar in the face." And then, meanwhile, back at Angie's house, he is putting an ice pack on his face, to make the swelling go down. And he and 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 him and Andy are talking, and Andy is saying 5,000 clams. Well, Oscar, how do you talk yourself into this? How do you talk yourself into these situations? And then Oscar says, "I don't know, and it's just because I'm a little fish in a big pond, and I want some of that." And then seeing what Oscar is looking at, Angie thought that he meant Mrs. Sanchez, and then he says, "No, ill, no, that." and Angie can see that he is pointing at the top of the reef. On top of the reef where the somebodies live, he says. And then Oscar says, except I don't have that. Instead, I'm stuck down here. And then Angie says, well, what's wrong with down here? And then Oscar says, I'll tell you what's wrong with down here. Do you remember my dad? He actually worked at the whale wash his whole life. And I thought working at the wash was the coolest thing in the world until I learned something. So, Oscar's dad was a tongue scrubber, and all the kids in the elementary school made fun of him because his dad was a tongue scrubber. And Oscar says that he just wants to be a somebody. So Angie, my perfect girlie, she gives Oscar her grandmother's pearl to sell and to get the money for Mr. Sykes, but not after telling the story that her grandmother gave it to her and that it built from a tiny speck of sand. And all it needs to do is have a little patience and faith, and you will be fine, she said to Oscar. Well, turns out the next day, Oscar got the money and he was going to give it to Mr. Sykes with Angie's help. And then he went over to the racetrack and overheard some fish saying that the race is rigged and you can't lose if you bet on a fish called Lucky Day. So Oscar takes the money that he got from the pearl and actually bets on Lucky Day. The 5,000 clams that he was supposed to give to Mr. Sykes, he used it for the bet on Lucky Day. And then we meet Lola, a pretty fish, but when she heard that Oscar was a millionaire, she was all in. She was swimming up to him, asking his name. And then he says, my name is Oscar. Let me take you to my box. And then he bumps into his boss, Mr. Sykes. And then Mr. Sykes says, your box? You can't even afford the gum under the seats. And then Lola tells Mr. Sykes that he just bet 5,000 clams on Lucky Day. I think he can afford anything he wants. But Oscar is telling Lola to stop, but she doesn't. And then when Mr. Sykes hears this, he says, my $5,000, you had the money to pay me back and you spent it anyway? And then Oscar says, don't worry about it. The seahorse is gonna win because I heard it from a and then and then Oscar says, don't worry about it, the seahorse is gonna win. Don't worry about it. So Lola swims off, and then Oscar says, wait, Lola, don't go. And then Lola says, look, deep down, and then Lola says, look, deep down, I am really superficial. And, and, and you are really, really cute, but you're nobody. And then she swims away. And then Bernie and Ernie mock him with the hot dogs that they got at the concession stand. And then Mr. Sykes tells Oscar that you better pray that this horse of yours comes through. And then at first and then the horse race doesn't really go that well. But Lucky Day actually gets out of the stall and ends up doing really good. But then, when he's almost close to the finish line, he trips and he loses the race. But what's so sad though is because he was so close, Oscar and Mr. Sykes hug, and then when he trips, Oscar tries to keep the hug going. And then Mr. Sykes says, hey, let me go, I want to see. And then when he sees that the horse fell and didn't win the race, and that another horse won the race, the boys, Oscar and Bernie, take Oscar out into the sea and they hang him upside down and they just talk to him and torture him and saying, don't worry about a thing because every little thing's gonna be alright. And while that is happening, we cut over to Lenny and his brother Frankie and his father having dinner at this restaurant. And the father is telling Lenny that, come on, you are not being a shark, and actually running this business is not just for Frankie, it's for Lenny, it's for the both of you. and I have a reputation to obtain. And then Lenny says, I know, Pop, I'm letting you down, and I'm sorry. And then his dad tells him, here, right here in front of me now, eat this. And then we can see that he is holding a shrimp. Keep this in mind because the shrimp will come back and play later. We can see that he is holding the shrimp, and the shrimp is saying, oh, have mercy, please don't eat me because I have a family. I am taking care of my sister's baby after she passed away. His story is just so sad. He said, I am taking care of my sister's baby after she passed away. Please do not eat me. And I am working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Please do not eat me. And then his father just keeps pressuring him. Eat the fish. Eat it. And then Lenny yelled at his dad and says, Dad, put the shrimp down. And then he takes the shrimp, takes all of the shrimp, and pushes them out of the window and says, Go, 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 go. You are free now. Go. And then, since everybody in the restaurant saw, his brother Frankie says, Look, Pop, I can handle the reef. It's no problem. And then the dad says, No, we're doing this as a family. Frankie, I want you to take Lenny out and show him the ropes. And Lenny, you're going to learn how to be a shark, whether you like it or not. So he takes him out the next day, and they see Oscar and they actually see Oscar hanging upside down with the jellyfish still there, but when they see the sharks, they run. So Frankie tells Lenny, There, Lenny, see that? A TV dinner, easy as pie. And then Lenny says, I can do this. What if I can't do this? And then Frankie says, Well, don't bother coming home if you can't. So, so Frankie, so Frankie is encouraged. So Frankie is encouraging Lenny to go eat Oscar. And so Lenny swims up to Oscar, and Lenny says, All right, here's the deal. I'm not going to eat you. I'm just going to pretend to eat you, and when I say go, you go. And so he pretends to eat Oscar, and then Lenny is proud of him. But when he looks closely, he can see that the fish is still alive. And then Frankie says, That's it. I had it up to here. And then he chases Lenny and Oscar, but then an anchor falls on Frankie. And then when when Oscar's eyes are closed, Lenny hears the anchor, and then he goes see if Frankie's okay. And then Frankie says, "I'm so cold, Lenny." And then Lenny says, "It's just because we're cold blooded." And then he hits Lenny. And then he hit. And. And then he hits Lenny. And then Frankie is dead. But when the jellyfish hear but when the jellyfish hears the anchor when they're swimming away from the sharks, they think it was Oscar because Oscar was doing some karate when the jellyfish swims up, and Oscar saw that Frankie was dead, but he thought Frankie was still moving because he heard the anchor, but he didn't really see what happened. So I okay. He heard something, but the last thing he remembers is that Frankie was trying to eat him. And he thought that Frankie was okay and was still going to eat him. And then the jellyfish came, and they actually saw. Okay, so here what happened. Lenny saw that the anchor killed his brother Frankie. This whole entire interaction with Frankie and the anchor, Oscar's eyes were closed. So Lenny saw the anchor hit him, but Oscar didn't. And so Lenny is Lenny is crying and saying, "Oh no, how will I explain this to Pop? No." And Lenny runs away. And then when Oscar opens his eyes, he sees that Frankie is dead. And then the jellyfish come back, Bernie and Ernie come back, and they think Oscar killed the shark. And so Oscar tells them that they killed the shark. Next thing I know, he's telling a whole group of people in Kate Curran that he killed the shark. So he is now known as Oscar the Shark Slayer. And he gets rich. He lives on top of the reef and he is getting all this attention, but Leo, Frankie and Lenny's father, is still searching for the shark slayer that killed his son. So he tells everyone at the funeral that I want to find out who this guy is. I want to know where he lives, where he sleeps, how he breathes. And I will not rest until I find the shark slayer. So Lenny makes it home, but after he hears what his son says about Lenny being about ab- ab- about how ab- about how Frankie is his son and he was supposed to take over the reef, and not talking about Lenny that way. After Lenny disappeared, Lenny decided to stay gone. So sharks are searching out for Lenny when Oscar is in his penthouse with all his friends and Angie, and she is like really, 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 really proud of Oscar. And she even bought him a lava lamp to put in his cool new house. And they are talking, and Oscar steps out of the room to go get her present. And it is a necklace with her grandmother's pearl in it. And then Lola showed up and says, "Oh, I'm not interrupting anything, am I?" And then Angie says, "Yes, we're talking." And then Oscar says, "No." And then Lola says, "Well, you don't mind if I borrow him for a while, do you?" And then Oscar and Lola swim away while the sharks are looking for Lenny. Another fish spots the sharks in the ocean, and then a fish comes up Oscar's elevator and says, "Sharks, sharks." And then everybody starts panicking, and then Oscar starts panicking and says, "Everybody go home and spend time with your loved ones while you still can." And then everybody freezes and then looks at Oscar, and then Lola looks at Oscar, and then Oscar says, "Lola, sweetie, just give me a minute to take care of this." And then everybody says, "Oscar, you're awesome." Everybody's like putting out comments like, "Go get him, Tiger." And when the elevator closes, you can hear him cry. Because he thinks that this is the end and that the sharks are gonna get him. So he hides there until the sharks are gone. But the sharks that they sent, that Leo that Leo Don sent them out there to just find money. They're not looking for trouble. And then and then the two one of the sharks that is swimming with the other shark says, "Shh, there is a shark slayer around here. Do you want to get killed?" And then he says, "Oh, sorry." And then he whispers, "Lenny." And then Oscar's safe because the sharks don't know where Oscar is. And then Oscar says, "Whew, that was close." And then Lenny says, "Yeah, that really was a close one." And then when Oscar looks up, he sees Lenny. And then Oscar tells him, and then Oscar begins to scream. And then Lenny begins to scream, and then he says, "Shh, he could be anywhere." And then Oscar says, "Who?" "The Shark Slayer," Lenny says. And then Oscar says, "There is no real Shark Slayer." And then he says, "Ha ha 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 ha. Oh, yes, there is." And then and and then Oscar says, "Ha ha 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 ha. No, there is not." And then Lenny says, "Well, what do you mean?" And then Oscar says, "I made the whole thing up." And then Lenny says, "Oh, now I remember. With the anchor and my brother and you and 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 instead of telling the truth, you told everyone that you killed my brother." And then Lenny figured out, instead of telling the truth, you told everyone that you killed my brother. And then he says, "Oh, you're a liar." And then, and then, and then, and And then Lenny tells Oscar that he can't go home. So Lenny asks to stay with Oscar. And then Oscar says no. But Lenny says, "Okay then, well, if somebody finds out the truth about the shark player on my way back," and then Oscar says, "You wouldn't." And then Lenny says, "Oh, I would." And then Oscar says, "Of course you can stay with me." And then they hug, and then Lenny and Lenny and Oscar go to the back of the car wash where Oscar lives. Well, that must be Oscar's hideout. Or 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 it could be where Oscar used to live. But it says car wash exit, so I don't know what this room is. This could be his old house or the car wash exit because it says car wash exit on it. So maybe he bought an apartment in the building of the car wash. What? I don't know. I don't know. And And he uses the old room for him and Lenny to stay in. And then Leo, Lenny's dad, doubled the search, and so what ends up happening is Oscar and Lenny get busted by Angie, and Angie gets to know everything from Lenny about how it was an accident and that he didn't really kill Frankie. And then Angie learned everything from Lenny that Oscar didn't really kill Frankie, Anchor did. And then Angie says, everybody thought you just slayed the shark, but here was here was gonna well here's what's gonna happen, Oscar. You tell the truth and you go home. And then they both laugh at Angie's suggestion, and then Angie says, "What do you think? You could just slay one shark and everything will be fine and dandy for the rest of your life?" And then Oscar says, "Yeah." And then Lenny says, "Actually, you're not thinking hard enough." And Lenny comes up with the idea that he can fake his death so he can disappear so he don't have to go home. And Oscar can keep the impression up that he is the shark slayer. So Lenny comes out and he pretends to be a big hungry shark for fish. But as we know, Lenny is a vegetarian, so he doesn't really eat fish. So he is just fake. So they put on the show, and Lola was watching the whole thing, and Lola and Oscar kiss on live TV. And Angie sees this and she gets mad because Oscar is not being himself. And then Angie tells Oscar that she thought Oscar was a somebody. After they are arguing and and Oscar says, "Nobody loved me when I was a nobody." And Angie says she did. Before the money, before the fame, she thought that Oscar was a real somebody. But now he's a big nobody. And then Angie tells Oscar to go. And even though Lenny tried to cheer up, she still starts to cry. And then Lenny says, "Oh, come on, Angie. It's gonna be okay." And then Oscar leaves to go home. And then Angie comes to talk to him and says, "Hey, Shark Slayer, what are you doing in here? All your friends are inside." And then Oscar says, "Well, not all my friends. And then she says, "Oh, are you talking about that girl from the whale wash?" And then Lola says, "Let me guess. She told you that she loved you. Is that it?" And then Lola starts to laugh, and then and then and and then and then and and then Lola says, "It's not like you feel the same way about her." And then Oscar realized that he does, and he breaks up with Lola, and then Lola beats up Oscar. But in the next scene, he is okay, and he's got flowers and balloons, and he is going to tell Angie that he loves her. But when he makes it to the whale wash, he gets a call from Lenny's father telling him that they got Angie and that if he doesn't come and face them, Angie is gone. But Oscar but Oscar tells Sykes the truth that he is not the real shark slayer. But he says, but the sharks don't know that. So they go so they actually go to meet the sharks. They go to meet the sharks. And Oscar but and Oscar pretends to be the tough guy and says, "Hey, my manager Sykes just told me that 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 not to go crazy on you guys. So I may listen to him, but then again I may not. So watch yourself now." And so he gets Lenny pretending to be a dolphin to eat Angie when she is presented on a platter. And actually Oscar did pretty good with this because everybody was afraid of him. And Leon and Leon and and actually and and actually Leon actually tells Oscar, "You are gonna regret the day that you killed both of my sons." And he actually shows Angie on a platter, but Oscar laughs at this and says, "You guys got nothing. Sebastian, take her out, and Lenny eats her." And Sykes and Lenny try to warn Oscar not to talk so much and just go, but Oscar is on a roll here, he thinks, and doesn't want to stop talking until Lenny throws Angie back up along with a lot of other stuff he ate. And then this is when Leon, his father, knows that is Lenny, And he says, "What are you doing? What are you wearing? What is this? You are dressed like a dolphin. Don't you understand how embarrassing this is?" And Oscar tries to calm him down and says, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's just calm down for a minute, all right? Let's just calm down." And then Leon says, "You killed my one son, and then you gotta turn my Lenny into a dolphin? It's over for you, Shark Slayer." And then Lenny and Angie tell Oscar to swim away, and he ends up swimming into the whale wash and actually frightening everybody and actually setting a trap for Leon to get trapped into the whale wash, and then he thinks he got him, but he actually got Lenny instead. So he actually pushes. So he actually gets Leon stuck into the brushes. Real good. He gets him stuck into the brushes real good. And then everybody sees this. And then everybody says, "Oh, way to go, Shark Slayer! Way to go, 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 Shark Slayer!" Oh, and did I forget to tell you? Lola was working for Leon the whole entire time. So, yeah. So, now that we got that out of the way, so when he captures the two sharks, so everybody at the well wash says, "Way to go, Shark Slayer! Way to go! Way to go, hero!" And then Oscar yelled out, "I am not the real Shark Slayer. It was the anchor that killed Frankie." And then he tells Leon that he just needs to be accepting of Lenny. So he likes to eat fish. No, 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 no. I'm sorry, you guys. And and um and 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 Oscar tells Oscar tells Oscar tells Leon that he needs. So Oscar asks Leon, "What is your problem?" "So your son eats kelp. So your son's best friend. So your son's best friend is a fish. But you need to learn that Lenny is fine just the way he is, and his friends love him just the way he is." And then Leon says, "Can you get me out of this thing so I can hug my son?" So Leon and Lenny hug, and then Leon tells Lenny that he loves him no matter what. And then Oscar and Angie kiss. And then at the end, Oscar and Mr. Sykes end up opening a new whale watch as partners. And then and and then while Oscar is setting up his new office, he puts a picture of his dad on his desk, and Andy says, "Come on, Mr. Manager." And then Oscar says, "Just a sec, Aunt. I gotta put this picture on my desk." And then we see his dad with the tongue scrubber in his hand. And then Oscar says, "Love you, Pop." And then Oscar swims out with Andy, and they are celebrating the new whale watch, which the little kids are working at, giving them like new looks. Like they are spraying paint on the sharks, giving them new looks. And we close on the iconic song Car Wash. And then there's the end credit where Lola goes back to Oscar's penthouse, but he is not there. And Crazy Joe is there. The lobster from the crab from the beginning. And Lola says, "Oscar, baby, you gotta be crazy not to want me back." And then and then Crazy Joe says, "Did somebody say crazy?" And he's got a flower in his mouth. And then that's the end of the movie. And that is the end of Shark Tale. Bye, and see you guys in my next video.